Sheria Smith, you are somebody who has been both personally impacted by the decisions coming from this administration as it pertains to the Department of Education. Talk to us about how the Supreme Court's latest machinations and the administration's effort to fire over 1,000 of your colleagues. How is that? What is the fallout? Talk to us about what's happening, and how are you navigating this moment?
And thanks, Lurie. Man, what came down from the Supreme Court on Monday, I can't even consider it a ruling. It was just a paragraph, copy pasting what this administration has that's sent to them. This administration is saying, oh, the president needs to have power, not the Secretary of Education, but the president needs to have power to destroy this agency, the Department of Education, to return education to the states. But what is so curious to me is that the states filed the lawsuit. 18 states were like, no, we don't do the work of the US Department of Education. We need the funding from the federal government that is meted out by the US Department of Education. The American Federation of Teachers joined that lawsuit. Teachers are saying, hey, we need the support that we receive from the US Department of Education, put these people back to work. But yet the majority of the justices, not all of them, we have, a 16-page dissent and a paragraph from the rest of them, and I'm like, they make too much money to only just be copy and pasting a paragraph.
Ciao.
But saying, the president and the US Department of Education can do what they will, which but they did not say that these terminations were legal. And so the reason why there was a stay was that there is a huge question about whether the layoffs are actually legal. Our view, of course, is that they are not. And so the lower court said, hey, in case they are not legal, instead of spending money to give these people back pay or losing out on these resources, stop these layoffs, put these people back to work until we figure out whether, the process that you've used is legal or not. That question is still up in the air.
Wow.
But so what the Supreme Court has allowed this administration to do is to fire us, knowing that there is a likelihood that these firings will be overturned, but that means that the American people will have to pay more money in back pay to us. You will lose valuable people, to terminate people for months now will do irreparable harm,
Mm.
as the states have already said, to the funding of our education. And we already are seeing that. We're seeing so many schools, including my alma mater, Harvard, crying out about the lack of funding they are receiving from the federal government.
So this lawsuit that was filed by these 18 states, what's interesting is that in the time that they have taken to file this case, something else that the Supreme Court has done has basically created an environment where if there is we can no longer have a nationwide injunction when it comes to a lower level court saying, hey, this thing that the administration is trying to do is largely unlawful. And so we're going to prevent them from doing it at the nationwide level. Now we're in a situation where only the states that actually sue tend to be the ones who are going to get any relief. And so while these 18 states attorneys general did file this lawsuit on behalf of the educators and the families in those states that are saying, no, we need the federal government to play this role, the other states that did not file would not necessarily be able to get access to the same benefits and relief that these 18 states might get. So even winning this lawsuit isn't going to provide a nationwide solution. It might provide a solution for those 18 states, but we're in this weird space where the law doesn't mean the law and precedent doesn't mean precedent right now. And if you could talk with us about what has happened to the capacity to provide the essential services that the Department of Education has traditionally provided. What has happened to those services? What are some of the services that have been either negatively impacted through cuts and that have been completely taken off the table? The last time you were here, I told you we were filling out our FAFSA form, and you were like, hope somebody's there to fill it out and to evaluate it, because most of the people who were doing that evaluative work were a part of the group that had been excommunicated from the department. What is the nature of service provision from the Department of Education right now? And we got schools opening in 6 weeks in some states. What does this mean for us as parents?
Right. We already have a 6.8 billion funding freeze for states for Title I funding. And so, we talk about it's a shame that more states weren't plaintiffs in this lawsuit, because all of them are going to feel it in a very ones that, were behind the president, clapping them on to get rid of our agency are, it's their citizens that are going to feel it most. Um, but when you talk about eliminating Title I funding and special education funding, this close to the beginning of the school year, that means that there will not be resources for students who have special needs.
Mm.
That means that, local communities are going to have to raise taxes. Um, and I don't know how they're going to do that when, you have so many people unemployed. This administration is trying to fire, this administration, which is the largest employer in the country, is trying to fire their workforce. Where is this money going to come from when you are um, eliminating avenues for people to actually earn money, and you are eliminating the funding source with the U.S. Department of Education? But there's so many things I wanted to unpack in your question, but I don't want to riff too long. But I'm extremely afraid of what is going to happen. And we've been sitting in on meetings as a union from this agency, and every meeting, the managers are saying we cannot do this work. Sat in on a meeting just yesterday in the Office of Safe and Supportive Schools, where they sent out a survey to states about asking the states, oh, aren't you glad that things are being, education's being returned to you?
Mm.
And most of those states were like, wait, we already had control over education, but what we would like returned to us is the funding to actually support our migrant kids, to support our low income kids, our special need kids. How can we do any of the work? It's great you said education's returned to us. It never left us, but
Mm.
you have not given us the support that we need to actually do the work.
So we have essentially a 6 week timeline where states are now having to adjust in real time to figure out where the funding is going to come from these services. And if you are in a donor state, like New York is a donor state. California is a donor state. You might have the capacity to shift resources around in ways that will allow you to fill in some of the gaps. I believe Governor Kathy Hochul here in the state of New York, who I roundly criticize because I criticize people in leadership because that's my role. But she, and working alongside with the Democrats here who are in leadership in this state, is essentially committed to ensuring that there was going to still be free food programs, lunch and breakfast programs and whatnot. But at the same time, Republican governors were making different decisions, and governors like Greg Abbott rejecting millions of dollars that would have provided food for hungry children. And so in the states that are donor states where we give more money to the federal government than we give back, they might have the capacity to absorb that. It's the other states, the non-18, the remaining states that didn't file a part of this lawsuit, and those states that are not donor states but are the welfare states. We have a number of states, most of which, like to the tune of 90% plus, are Republican-led states that do not have any real tax structure or basis upon which they can increase the spending capacity on programs like this. They're already not sending enough money to the government such that they are receiving money from the government. They are not sending money out there. What is going to happen to the communities in those states who are not going to have a leadership structure that's going to ensure that those needs or those gaps get filled? Even if they can't get fully filled, they're not going to have any resources. What can they expect from this dismantling, or should I say the demolition, of the Department of Education?
Well, I mean, what their citizens are going to experience is a limitation of what they're going to be able to do, what their children are going to learn, and then the jobs that those children could take on,
Mm.
their children's ability to attend college. Just as an example, I'm from one of those welfare states. I'm from Indiana. I live in Texas, and I grew up in a town called Gary, Indiana, which doesn't have a very large property ownership base. So our tax base was very limited, but luckily, because of federal funding, I attended an academically gifted school that allowed me to take SATs, to learn Japanese, to go to operas. Um, and then because my mom only made $28,000 a year, allowed me to attend Harvard on a Pell Grant.
Mm.
And then allowed me to go into the classroom and teach students in similar economic communities, because I was not burdened by student loans, because the federal government, through the Pell Grant, allowed me to continue my education with, from an Ivy League institution, graduating only with $5,000 in debt.
Mm.
And then when I became a teacher, because I was in public service, that debt was forgiven by the US Department of Education, which allowed me to teach other students who grew up in poor communities, who, to help them excel in their state tests. They were in Texas. They were the top performing students in our school district. But in Texas, that's a low bar, unfortunately. Uh, but and
Mm.
then it allowed me to go to law school. You're not going to, with the elimination of the Department of Education, you're going to have less and less stories like me, less and less people who came from low income families who are able to change the trajectory of their lives and impact other low income students. You're going to have less teachers who less people who can afford to take a role in teaching. You're going to have less doctors who can afford to work in low income communities, less lawyers who can afford to work in low income communities because they have taken out the funding source. And so you must wonder why any elected official would want to limit the opportunities and the aspirations of their citizens. It, it is a curious thing to me.
Mm. Well, I got some suspicions, but I'll wait until you are no longer here because I don't want to besmirch you with my positings. We had a conversation on Tuesday here, recognizing that these folks really just don't like us, like people who are in positions of power, and by us, I mean poor people, I mean Black people, I mean people
Mhm.
who are not upper crust, wealthy white elites, and so we also recognize that is of course of a variety of stories that came out in the news over the past week or so, that when Black people first got the right to vote, really Black men, when they first got the right to vote vis-a-vis the 15th Amendment, one of the first things they did was to vote themselves into electoral office, and they part of those electoral positions included being tax assessors. And Black elected officials then implemented a tax scheme that would raise money for the implementation of the first statewide public school programs. And it was a phenomenal thing that allowed even poor white people to overcome their sort of centuries of indoctrination in frames of anti-Blackness, and where they were saying, well, wait a minute, I know that we're not supposed to like those Black people because they're supposed to be slaves, but when they got in power, one of the first things they did was try to create school systems that all of our kids could go to. So I like that. And I'm going to like that more than I like these wealthy people telling me I should not be in alignment with them because those wealthy people weren't giving me anything. Now, that only lasted a brief period during Reconstruction. But what we realized was then, and then even after Reconstruction, after, Jim Crow and racialized terroristic violence becomes part of America's, well, it was continuing in the new America coming out of the Civil War, what we also realized is that when Black people would move into spaces where they were establishing towns and cities and whatnot, one of the first things they did was build schools. And even throughout segregated education, you might not have given us any resources for schools. That's how we got to Brown versus Board of Education. People were fighting for the resources, not to sit next to children of other communities that were being taught to hate them, but for the resources, because there's no reason we should be paying taxes for school buses and we don't get a school bus. And we got to walk past 3 of your schools just to get to the one room schoolhouse that houses all of us. So no matter what we have faced, whether it was enslavement, whether it was post-Civil War, whether it's Jim Crow America, making sure that we were in control of educating our children really featured very prominently in the imagination of Black people. In this moment where our school structures, the federal school structures are being dismantled and we're sort of abandoning them to the states, that's going to mean various things depending on where you live. What does that legacy of Black communities recognizing, seeing what time it is, and being very clear that these people who have only benefited from oppressing us, we should not be trusting them with the education of our children. We have now been forced into a reset of sorts. What does your understanding about education as an educator, what does that history tell you that we should be doing in terms of making sure that as all of this is working its way through the courts or not, how should we as a community be responding to ensure the needs of our children get met, regardless of who is funding it?
Yeah, I think your question is very complicated because even the term Black community uh, is means different things. I think before Brown versus Board of Education, when we did have segregation, there was a clear Black community. Certainly, our schools are funded by neighborhoods, by cities. Um, but unfortunately, because this country never did separate but equal.
Mm.
People with means Black people with means, then had to make the choice to stay in the old Black community or to make their children minorities in another city that would have more resources. And
Ooh.
so when we and that left, you know, um, I was extremely fortunate in Gary as someone who, grew up poor, that we still had a bit of a Black community with economic diversity. Uh, Even unfortunately in Gary, that's less so now than it was in the
Mm.
80s when I was growing up. But for those who remain in communities that are primarily Black, um, there's going to be a need certainly to provide their own funding. But the question I have is that many of the people who remain in those communities may not have the economic
Mm.
wherewithal to do the funding. This is, and I, how, if you're living hand to mouth, if you don't own your home, you're not paying property taxes.
Right.
If
That's
you're
right.
living hand to mouth, how can you uh, you know, provide more funding for your schools? I mean, for the schools in your city. If you're working, crazy 12-hour days on your feet, how can you homeschool your kid? I think we really have been backed up in a corner. I think what people must do is demand that the people that get paid more than they do to represent them actually do their jobs and represent them. I don't think that we resign ourselves to say, oh, you know, the elite are just going to keep being the elite. They are paid handsomely
Mm.
to for us. And we must demand that they work for us, not just at the polls, but we need to be in the streets. We need to be at their offices. We need to make noise to make sure that they do right by our kids because we are in a situation currently in this country where neighborhoods are more segregated than ever, particularly by social economic class. And so when we're talking about eliminating funding for poor people, um, you know, you can't get blood out of radishes.